A couple of days ago, I had an interesting exchange with Kenneth Whyte, who's the publisher of Sutherland House. Whyte is well known in Canadian political and journalistic circles. He was kind enough to reply to my comment. Now, what Whyte has been doing for a while is posting about the effect of library borrowing on books sales, and he's been waging basically a one person campaign against the habit that contemporary libraries have developed of stocking a lot of best-selling books and trying to get more clients into their libraries by enticing them with these readily available, free to access best-selling books. Now, he's caused quite a bit of consternation among supporters of libraries because his argument, and I think this is partly an effect of the way he himself employs his rhetoric, has been interpreted as an attack on libraries generally. But in any case, I'm going to read a little bit from an article. He's written several articles on this topic by now. And I'm going to read from the most recent one and then respond to some of his points. People on the library side haven't appreciated my earnest researches. They've called me stupid and mean, fingered me as the sort of person who would, quote, have burned the library at Alexandria, unquote, and tweeted that I must have failed as an author, failed as a publisher, or been kicked out of a library for watching internet porn. All of them deny a problem, although none have controverted my data. Some of my saner adversaries claim that people who borrow books also buy books, which is true, but beside the point since the vast majority of books are still being borrowed rather than bought. Others point out that libraries pay for books on their shelves and encourage people to read, which helps book sales, which is also true, but library buying is scarcely material in the scheme of things, and again, the vast majority of books are borrowed rather than bought. And then the argument continues. If there wasn't some switching between buying and borrowing, why would libraries work so hard to impress upon patrons how much money they can save by borrowing rather than buying books? The American Library Association, ALA, circulates a handy savings calculator if you can't do the math in your head. A BookNet survey asked Canadians why they use libraries, and pretty much all of us admitted to, and he crosses out, ironically, being cheapskates, preferring free books to bought books, and then he cites some statistics. I believe it is self-evident that spending loads of taxpayer money to make the most popular books available at no charge at dozens of points around a city, as well as online, undermines retail sales of books as it would if the same were done for coffee, running shoes, or Leafs tickets. I have to admit, at the same time, that I've lacked hard evidence showing a portion of book borrowing represents lost sales. Nobody has thoroughly researched the question. It certainly isn't in the interests of libraries to do so. The absence of a smoking gun has made it easy for library defenders to throw up their hands. Maybe there's a relationship, maybe not. People love free shit and will cheerfully strangle good faith to retain access to it. I've tried to devise ways to prove conclusively that libraries are undermining book sales. Maybe some huge experiment where we close the public libraries in a large jurisdiction and study what happened to retail book sales. But who is going to organize that? It seemed impossible until COVID-19 stepped up. Libraries across North America and indeed around the world have been closed, semi-closed, or otherwise limited in their borrowing activities throughout the 2-year course of the pandemic. According to Library Journal, total circulation of library materials collapsed by 25.7% in 2020, notwithstanding the huge spike in e-book borrowing. Pay attention to that detail. It looks like physical borrowing fell by roughly half. The 2021 numbers aren't out yet, but individual library reports suggest they will look a lot like 2020. Meanwhile, over in publishing land, the champagne corks are flying. U.S. book sales, which grew healthily in the first pandemic year 2020, grew again in 2021 and are now 19% ahead of the pre-pandemic year 2019. All the major publishers have reported smashing sales, attributing the increase to their own genius. All categories are up, including adult fiction, 31% over 2019, and adult nonfiction, 10% over 2019. Going by these numbers, it appears that a roughly 25% reduction in library borrowing leads over a 2-year period to an increase 19% in book selling. I wouldn't bank on those numbers or even on the rough proportions, but I think the data demonstrates that when you make books more difficult to borrow for free, people turn frequently to booksellers. The skeptics will say it has nothing to do with libraries. We're in a pandemic, you idiot. People are locked down. Most of us are reading, and probably a lot of us who've been readers are reading more than we would have in the past, accounting for the extra buying. That seems a plausible counter, and it was sufficient to keep me from spouting off until this week when new data emerged from Pew Research. Pew has been surveying book readership in the U.S. for the last decade. Its latest results show that 75% of Americans read a book last year, which, pandemic notwithstanding, is not out of the ordinary. Over the last decade, between 72 and 78% of Americans have reported reading a book in the given year. That indicates the increase in book sales hasn't come from new readers. It must have come from the usual readers buying more books in the past, not according to Pew. Americans, quote, read an average mean of roughly 14 books during the previous 12 months, and the typical median American read 5 books in that period, end quote. That is not out of the ordinary either. In fact, those numbers are identical to 2011 when Not a Soul was locked down. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think, it's an interesting argument, and Whyte really can build a powerful argument rhetorically, and he is citing a lot of statistics, but I still don't think that he's proven his case. And the real problem, there are 2 problems that I would like to focus on. The first is that he sort of refers kind of vaguely to libraries having closed down or partly closed down. I happen to have a friend who works in the Toronto library system, and she has been going to work most of the time during this pandemic. The figures that show a decrease in borrowing don't necessarily, I mean, you do really have to be careful with interpretation of statistics. The decrease in borrowing doesn't necessarily mean that people are necessarily just staying home and not going to libraries and therefore buying their books physically. Keep in mind, too, that physical bookstores have been closed for much of this period. So people have been doing activity online. I think that it is really important. I mean, one of the truisms of interpreting any kind of statistical research is that correlation does not equal causation. Obviously, as Whyte himself acknowledges in this article of his, the fact that people are at home because of the pandemic is basically a very strong determinant of their leisure time behavior. And it is just as logical to argue that they are reading more because they are stuck at home. And so the increase in book sales, I would say, is more because of that stay-at-home aspect of the pandemic than because of any strict cause and effect relationship between libraries siphoning off book sales from bestsellers. You have to keep in mind that bestsellers are bestsellers, and as a publisher of a major American book publishing house once commented to me, books that don't sell just keep on not selling. But these days in the 21st century, books that do sell well tend to dominate more and more of the market. And you can see that in the sales figures of the really boffo big sellers like the Harry Potter series or 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, the degree to which these books were selling was enough to float entire companies. and float the bookselling industry, for example, in the UK. Now, the second point that I'd like to focus on is when I did have an exchange with Kenneth Whyte, he seemed to be under the impression that I was criticizing him for focusing too much on Canada and not enough on the international situation. I have to correct Kenneth because I think I expressed myself clearly enough the first time around, but if not, I'll try again. I'm not saying that you or other arts journalists in Canada focus too much on Canada. I wish you would. I wish you all would. As you can see from the quotes in this particular article, they rely very heavily on statistical research done in the United States. The only Canadian stats that are in this article are from BookNet, an organization that's absolutely notorious for cherry picking the statistics that it wants to make public in order to sort of project a particular message, which is a very Canadian way of sort of solving social, cultural problems. In any case, I would like to see convincing statistics that show what the sales of Canadian-owned publishers have been during the course of the pandemic, because I'm skeptical that they're as good as those American figures, which in turn brings us back to the whole question of this cause and effect relationship between closed libraries and increased sales of books that you have to buy. One final point that I'd like to make is, and I hope that I don't look like I'm sort of trying to squeeze in self-promotion here, but what I'm about to say refers back to a post that I put up, a video post that I put up earlier. One area, and I'm thinking now specifically here of the scene in Canada, one area where books tend to sell well and have always sold well is in the area of material about World War II. And interestingly, Kenneth and another writer who I think is quite interesting, Mark Borey, who wrote a researched nonfiction book about early Canadian history, which apparently is selling quite well. The two of them decried the situation in Canada for researched nonfiction because that is a hard type of book apparently to sell profitably in Canada. The argument that I would make specific to World War II is one reason, but I would expand this argument actually if you want me to a lot of Canadian history. The reason that it's hard to sell these research nonfiction books, for example, about Canadians fighting during World War II, is because there are absolutely, there's an absolute, really obvious, painful shortage of researched fiction about the same era. And I have found that dealing with Canadian publishers, because I have a manuscript about Canadian soldiers, a novel about Canadian soldiers fighting at Juno Beach and then during the Normandy campaign, Canadian publishers are not interested in this material, and the responses that I've received are just plain weird. For example, one publisher said to me, well, the reason why Canadians don't want to hear about World War II anymore is because the veterans who came home in 1945 didn't want to talk about it. And nowadays, people have just lost interest. I mean, this isn't, I don't want to engage in name calling, but this is a weird observation. I pointed out to the same guy, the same publisher, no. American productions like Band of Brothers do extremely well, but they find that way of combining fiction and nonfiction together. Interestingly, there is one movie about Canadians fighting at Juno Beach. It's a docudrama, but it doesn't have the same power, the same emotional power that fiction has. And so I would recommend to Canadian publishers, first of all, if they do feel that the pandemic has an impact on their sales, it would be nice to find out what that impact has been. have sales increased? Second of all, I would like to underline that maybe there should be a discussion specific to Canada about the role that libraries have on book sales, whether it's positive or negative. And third, I would like to emphasize that from a thematic point of view, really, there might be a bit of a change that should take place in Canadian publishing, Canadian fiction publishing, because it may be that poor sales in some respects reflect thematic and topic choices that publishers in Canada are currently making.